I think, well, I've only done it with Zoom, but with Zoom, it gives you an option to do it, put it in the cloud or put it on your computer.
Okay.
And
So,
then you can just send us whatever form it comes in, and we'll just.
okay. Well, it says it's recording now. I guess I'll have to figure out where that's going.
I think it goes to your computer, like it just saves. I have to research. I haven't done Microsoft Teams, so I have to research
Yeah.
that.
I'm sure. I mean, my office does it all the time. So if I can't figure it out, I'm sure someone can point me to that on Monday.
Perfect. We're all learning new things with technology right now, huh?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, Anthony, did you want to start with the overview questions?
Yeah, so kind of like the first question, just kind of start off. We were just wondering why you or your organization would be interested or affected by the implementation of like green building codes.
Well, I guess there's a couple different ways to approach that. One is just as being a fellow citizen of the climate. Green building anywhere helps helps everyone everywhere, right? So we have a shared climate. So emissions in one jurisdiction don't stay there; they go planet wide, and so that's the big picture perspective of why I'm supportive of any kind of sustainability initiative that reduces the carbon emissions of a community. It helps everybody. So I guess that's the big picture, and then even more specifically, Boulder County, Louisville is in Boulder County, even though it's a separate jurisdiction, separate entity. We have shared boundaries, shared goals, shared funding. So Boulder County actually does quite a bit on a wide variety of ways to support the various communities that fall within and adjacent to our boundaries. So I guess there's a couple different reasons why this is really important to us. The other piece of it, I would say, is that I am the deputy director for the community planning and permitting department, but I'm also the building official, and for Boulder County. So I regulate the unincorporated areas of the county, and the better aligned the building codes are across these boundaries, the easier it is for our design contractor community and the material suppliers and everyone else who's involved with the construction industry to navigate the codes. So the smaller the discrepancies are from place to place, the easier it is for everybody to understand what's going on. So that was one of the major issues that was showing up when the green building codes first emerged, was that you really had to bring a pretty large group along, or else you ended up doing something that would confuse people who are not from that area. So that basic level of educating both the industry and then also the consuming public about these things, that all ties together. So for instance, if you have a lot of green building features that are in homes, but the realtors don't understand them, don't know how to talk about them, don't know how to sell them to maybe people from outside the community, it doesn't really work. And then if you have the appraisers who are looking at these properties for the banks, they don't understand the actual value of these things, it doesn't really work. So you really need a very large community to get educated on these topics in order to really be successful.
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, going off that, can you tell us about your experience with the green building codes?
Sure. So I guess just in a brief nutshell. So I started working for a production home builder in the late '90s, and that production home builder became very interested in learning about some new ways to build that were involving what was then considered sort of a novel topic of really doing better insulation and better construction practices to try and push the energy consumption of the homes that we were building down. So that was in the late '90s. I left that company after a while, we had really been working with, that was right around the time when the U.S. Green Building Council was emerging, and so we had done some work with some of the early folks there, as well as some of the folks in the national laboratories to sort of understand what was going on in buildings. And I ended up going back to school, got a degree in architecture, and then worked as an architect for a number of years, designing net zero or near net zero homes, trying to understand how to find that balance between energy efficiency and construction costs. We actually did do a fair number of design build projects where I could really get my hands deep into the details of how you do that. And then from there, I was doing some private consulting for a while on energy efficiency and sustainability. A lot of focus in that work was really on health and indoor air quality as it relates to some of these topics. And then from there, I joined Boulder County as their what they called the sustainability examiner. So it was my job to essentially administer the green building codes for Boulder County. And I've been with the county since then.
Nice. I guess you kind of already touched upon this question that we were about to ask Ness, but is there anything more you wanted to add about how you would think green building codes would benefit like cities like Louisville or other communities?
It has a benefit to everybody, but in a wide variety of ways. So as people who are living in a house that was built better, they're more comfortable. They have a quieter house. They have a house that uses less energy. One of the things that I was really intrigued, I did a major remodel of my own home. So my home was built in the late 50s. A number of years ago, I did a pretty deep energy retrofit of the home. And what I noticed was that I was expecting the lower energy bills because that had been part of my target. But what I really didn't appreciate until after the dust settled was not just how much more comfortable the house was, but how so I essentially was having I was keeping my house just a little bit warmer in the winter and a little bit cooler in the summer, and yet my energy bills were significantly lower than they used to be. But then also my house was quieter. I heard less of road noise. I heard hailstorms wouldn't or big rain events wouldn't wake me up in the night the way that they used to. So it was just a quieter, more comfortable house, and yet I reduced my energy consumption by 95% or something. So it was really a lot of direct benefits to me as a consumer. But then also the reduced carbon, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, this has a benefit on everybody and is really essential to decelerating the destabilization of the climate that we seem to be doing these days.
And do you have any specific experience with solar energy?
So I mean, you mean like solar panels or solar thermal systems?
Yeah.
I've been using and specifying and installing that sort of thing for on projects that I worked with as a designer for many years. When as a production home builder, we were actually starting to offer solar as an option at that point, which was a big deal. It was then seen as something people really liked, the resiliency aspect. Although combining that with batteries becomes more expensive, but people were looking at it then, and then I've installed it on many projects since then, solar in my own home. So photovoltaic, so I've done a lot of work with various solars and solar thermal systems. I also work with a number of folks who have been trying to find places to put solar gardens in the region, trying to help with that piece of it. It's a little complicated locally, but solar gardens are also so we have sort of rooftop solar, we have ground-mounted solar, and larger scale solar systems, and they all have their place. They all work together.
So I guess another question we would like to ask you is kind of like can you kind of like describe the process that like Boulder County went through to kind of like create their building green building codes as far as you know?
So Boulder County, back in the late 90s, started working on a green building code. And one of the things that I think was sort of critical was that a group a group of folks, both from Boulder County and the city of Boulder, and a group of very educated and concerned citizens got together very, very early on, and they actually formed a group called the Boulder Green Building Guild. It has since been renamed to the Colorado Green Building Guild. And so those three groups, the city of Boulder, Boulder County, and the Guild, worked hand in hand to try and bring some of these things into existence. And that organization formed really sort of a central clearinghouse for people to get together to talk about building code and building code issues, and the details of not just what are the codes, but how do you actually build to those codes. So we were able to, and I joined that organization early on, and been involved, deeply involved with it ever since. And that really brought a place where we could have regular meetings on the subjects, where we were actually, just like the guilds of old used to be. They were a place where people with some sort of technical expertise and technical interest got together and exchanged, trade secrets, and talked about what the problems were, talked about the solutions, brought new young people into the industry and helped get them educated. So it became just a great place to talk about these issues. And it ended up really going a long way to raising the overall level of knowledge and expertise about a wide variety of issues. So we had workshops. We would go to houses that were recently built by people who were trying to do something innovative, and we held these workshops in the house where we would actually do a tour of the house and we would have the people who worked on the house there. We would have experts critique the houses, and have these workshops that really went a long way to getting boots on the ground experience, understanding, well, what does it mean to build a better wall assembly? What does how do you install windows so they're sealed well? What do some of these mechanical systems look like? What are the pros, the cons, the parts that went well, the parts that didn't well? We learned so much from the mistakes that happen and the challenges that happen during the construction process. So it's one thing, for builders or material products suppliers to just stand on a podium and just talk about the wonders of their product. But what you really need to understand is for the guy who was actually in the field, or gal actually in the field installing these things, what did it look like? What worked? What didn't work, and what are the lessons that we can learn from that? So that experience was extraordinarily valuable in the early stages of writing these codes, to really raise that level of knowledge, so that both the city and the county had a series of more and more progressive building codes in those early years that really drove the market, but also helped raise that whole market up, so that we had a cohesive and industry-wide understanding of how to do these things. And you can really see the difference. So I participate in the code hearings on a national level. The International Code Council works on these things, and we have nationally promulgated building codes. And one of the things that was really interesting was, for instance, they were talking about the air tightness limits that should be in the code, and it was interesting to see that we had building officials get up and testify that they had changed their air tightness limits to a lower number, and they had contractors who couldn't get it. They couldn't figure out, they couldn't actually achieve these numbers. And it became clear through that experience that they were just trying to do it through the building codes, and they didn't have the rich body of professionals out there, the raters, to actually hold the workshops and show contractors how it was done, and they were really struggling. So it really became clear that you need a much more comprehensive approach in order to be successful in these things.
Wow, yeah, that definitely sounds like a lot went into it. Well, you kind of answered most of our next question, but do you know if you had any hearings or workshops or any sort of things with the public in that process? Because it sounds like you had definitely a lot of workshops and informal consultations with stakeholders, but was there like anything where it was just the public coming in saying what they thought?
Absolutely, absolutely. And most of the Colorado Green Building Guild's workshops were open to the public. Some were targeted at the trades, but many of them were targeted to the public too, because and that was a deliberate choice by the guild for pure marketing reasons, right? One of the reasons why some of the members joined the guild was to network and meet new clients. So they were looking for the clients who wanted a more energy efficient home. They wanted to find out who those folks were and have a chance to meet them. So those many of the programs that they did were really open to and targeted towards reaching out to members of the public. In addition to that, there were quite a few public hearings on the codes themselves. So the code development process, the code adoption process, there are required public hearings on these new codes, but it didn't stop there. There was an extensive outreach by both the City of Boulder and Boulder County and the Colorado Green Building Guild to reach members of the public. There was also quite a few voluntary programs that the city and the county were supporting to try and encourage things. And so through the years, it's been just a huge amount of effort trying to sell the ideas and explain the benefits of these features. You really needed to be driven by the public, because one of the things that does happen through these measures is that there's a fundamental shift of first costs versus operational costs, and that's really the crux of the matter in many ways, right? So if you're talking about insulation in the walls, well, that happens when you build it. It doesn't get retrofit very readily later, especially if you think about like insulation underneath a slab in the basement. That happens when the house is built. It doesn't get touched later, and so that's a cost that's paid for up front. But the operational costs moving forward are received by the homeowners. So you have to explain that relationship in order to get the initial buyers to be comfortable paying a little bit more upfront for something that's going to take them less money to operate over the life of their ownership. So that has to be explained. They have to be able to understand those numbers so that they feel like the extra value, the extra costs that they're paying is related to extra value that they're receiving.
Yeah, it makes sense, because how you were talking about how earlier, like realtors and stuff like that, they need to understand the process too in order to sell it to people. Otherwise, they would never be interested in. So I know you mentioned some outside groups, kind of like the city, the county, and then the Boulder Green Guild, you said.
The Colorado Green Building Guild.
Were there any other like outside groups that were kind of involved in the process of green building codes?
There's nothing that really jumps to mind as we definitely had some support from the Boulder Area Realtors Association. We worked with them on some projects. There's definitely programs through the AIA that have been part of it. I mean, there's actually quite a few organizations that have ties into this. Nationally, the U.S. Green Building Council, the USGBC, they've been pretty instrumental. We've had a lot of support from our national labs and the Department of Energy. Some of their programs are very, very important players right now in terms of administering and implementing this code. So we do use features from things like Energy Star or the Department of Energy Zero Energy Ready Home program. Those are really important. We also, probably one of the real key players is probably ResNet, the Residential Energy Services Network. So they are the key player in terms of training and credentialing and providing quality assurance for energy raters. Those folks have been really important, especially in this region. There's also BPI, a little less active right here locally, but also pretty important. So we couldn't have done this if we didn't have those energy professionals really trained on the technical aspects of how these things work. If you go to the Colorado Green Building website, you will see a host of organizations that support that organization, and those folks have really been critical to being successful.
Did you happen to see or hear any groups that were really outspoken about opposing it? And if so, did you see any potential conflicts between any of the groups in this process?
Yeah, there's been a couple of friction points. I would say that the biggest one is production home builders. And we don't have a huge production home building presence locally, but in general, that group locally and nationally, they are in a position where they are really competing with customers as they see it based upon first cost and first cost only. And they are not interested in pursuing things that have any negative effect on their profitability for on a quarter by quarter basis, and they are really focused on those first costs. So they continue to be probably the greatest opposition. We've also had a very complicated relationship with our large electric utilities. So for instance, while on one hand there are some kinds of retrofit programs that they are supportive of, there's also a great deal of reluctance for them, and understandably so, for them to be promoting measures that reduce their market share. So if for instance, if we take houses and make them off-grid or net energy producers, this is something that is problematic for a large investor-owned utility. So right, even today, we still struggle with some of the limits that they have arbitrarily, in some cases, put, not every case, but in some cases, arbitrary limits on the amount of solar production that a given homeowner might be allowed. So as a residential consumer, I can't put as much solar on my roof as I might want or might fit, because they will not let me put on more than what they expect me to be consuming. So they put limits on that do create problems in terms of what our consumers might be allowed to do.
And then I guess just kind of like put it in like an overall big picture, like I guess what do you see as like the overall main benefit, and then like the overall like main challenge of green building codes?
Well, I mean, I think the main benefit is to reduce the environmental impacts from construction. It's a very impactful process. There's a huge amount of energy that it takes to build a new building. When we finish a new building and walk through the door, all of those carbon emissions are fully in the air, and that may take. That's a significant amount of energy that is in the atmosphere, and that carbon will have an impact for a very, very long time. So if we're trying to decelerate climate change and climate destabilization, these things are at odds. So those climate changes have very, very concrete and direct impacts, both locally and worldwide. So that's a huge problem, and anything you can do to reduce that, I see as a benefit. We also have a lot of comfort benefits of it, as I mentioned before. We also have resiliency benefits. One of the things that was really eye-opening during some of the major hurricanes that hit the East Coast, maybe about 10 or 15 years ago, was that there were a whole bunch of houses where the storm left them relatively unscathed. They were intact houses, but they lost their power. They lost their utility connection, and all of a sudden, a winter storm moved in, and they became suddenly uninhabitable. Because they didn't have a lot of insulation. They weren't well air sealed. They didn't have good solar exposure. And so now all of a sudden, these folks were having to evacuate from an intact house and put further strain on the emergency evacuation services. So we had both people whose houses were directly impacted from the storms, and then we had a second wave of people who were evacuating because they were in houses that really were not particularly resilient. So if you have homes that have really good thermal envelope and they can coast and remain habitable for much longer, that provides resiliency that benefits everybody and leaves those emergency services for the folks that really need them. In terms of the downside, I think that it's really much easier to regulate to high levels of energy efficiency without adequately accounting for the embodied energy. So that makes that, in some cases, might lead us down the wrong path. So yes, we have a house that has that takes no energy on an annual basis to operate, but it might have 50 or 60 years of carbon already emitted by the time the homeowner walks to the door for the first time. So in those cases, we really haven't accomplished a big portion of what we're looking at. And right now, it's pretty hard to regulate for embodied energy. The laws don't allow us to do it, and the science behind calculating embodied energy still needs a lot of work to get to the same level for operational energy. Operational energy I can measure and quantify very precisely. I have meters on the outside of my house that measure electricity and gas consumption. I know exactly what's going in terms of those inputs, but it's much harder to tell. What was the embodied energy that went into this house? I don't have as easy a way to precisely measure that, and that's a weak spot.
I could definitely see that being a challenge. Now we're going to kind of get into the more nitty gritty of implementation and things of these green building codes. Are there parts of the green building codes that you think would work well for other counties, for example, Louisville, to implement? Well, I guess Louisville's not a county, but and do you think there are some that are not, that worked well for you guys, but may not work well for Louisville, or that sort of?
So I think what has worked the best, and this is sort of a universal recommendation, is things that the performance measurement, the performance pathway through the codes. So the codes are sort of divided in broad brush into prescriptive measures and performance measures. So a prescriptive approach will say, you need this much insulation in your walls, you need this much insulation in your ceiling, and I think those measures are pretty fundamentally limited in terms of how well they work, because in order to really get everything that you need to, that list starts to become really very long. And what I have found works better is the performance measures. So we really rely very heavily on things like the HERS rating as a way to regulate the code. It gives designers a lot of flexibility in terms of how they meet those codes, so they can accommodate whatever real world variation there is project to project and site to site. And that's, I think, an important thing to recognize, is that the starting point for projects is not always the same. And so a performance metric works really, really well. And it allows the elected officials to be very fundamentally able to adjust that based upon the tolerance of the community and where you're starting from. So the HERS requirements that are in place in Boulder County, they're fairly aggressive, and those numbers might be too aggressive for some communities to start off, right? They may have, we've been working our way up to these numbers. So our whole contractor community, the design community, they're understanding how to get here. If we just started with these numbers, it would be hard. So the idea of using something like a HERS rating that you can ratchet down over time becomes a very useful tool. And then I also strongly recommend combining this with some of the other programs that fill in around where the building codes don't. So we have been using like the Energy Star program for certifying homes and the Zero Energy Ready Home program for certifying homes. And those programs are very well structured to assist in getting the rest of the house to really fill in around for those things where the code just does not specifically address. And so you end up getting a pretty high quality house by using these programs, and they're readily achievable. These programs were designed not as an elite boutique rating, but something that was readily achievable by production home builders around the nation. So that would be really my recommendation, is to focus on using those three programs together: the HERS rating, Energy Star, and the Zero Energy Ready Home program, in conjunction with each other to really to regulate new home construction.
And then our next question, I feel like you kind of covered already a lot. It was just about speaking to the benefits or impacts of efficient buildings. Is there anything else you wanted to add on to that, or would you like us just to move on to the next question?
Well, I mean, the energy, the benefits, I think, are pretty well understood. I think, there's an important piece of it to keep in mind, is this element of time scale. Everyone gets obsessed with this idea of what's the payback period, and I think it's important to recognize that when we're regulating construction, we really need to be focusing on the buildings and not necessarily making decisions about any one specific homeowner. So we need to be taking a longer term perspective, because even though a homeowner, let's say worst case scenario, we're looking at somebody who builds a house with the intention of flipping it right after they sell it. So they're never going to live in the building. That building's still going to be there and still going to be using energy for many years. And so we need to be making decisions based upon the impact to the community from this structure over the life of the structure.
Excellent. And I think also Katie wanted us to specifically ask about renewable integration, so solar ready code requirements, and speaking about the benefits, impacts, positive or negative, on an efficient building.
Yeah, so I think it's really important that before we start adding renewables, specifically, we're talking about photovoltaics. We talk about solar thermal. Solar thermal, it's a little out of favor these days. It's not as popular as it used to be, but solar thermal systems can be deeply integrated into the structure itself, in terms of how the house is designed, making space for the tanks, designing mechanical systems that use these things. So that's a little bit more complicated. When we're talking about photovoltaic systems, which are what's dominating the market these days, you really want to make sure that you've addressed all of the construction of the house, the building envelope, the orientation, to try and reduce that load before we start adding renewables. So renewables has to come later. So we talk a lot about, the HERS index. A HERS 40 is about as low as you can comfortably get through building envelope improvements. So you want to push the house so as close to that 40 mark as possible, and then start adding photovoltaics to bring it the rest of the way to whatever your target is. It really does become a much more of a straight economic decision at that point, because We know how much the systems cost to install. We understand pretty precisely how much power they produce. It's a very much an economic decision that is a little bit detached from the rest of the complex process of designing a new building. Now, that said, you really need to be accommodating of a place for those systems to be installed. And whether that is a ground mount system that we see quite a few of in Boulder County, or a rooftop system that we also see quite a bit in the county, you want to make sure that the architect or the designer or the contractor, whoever's designing that building, you want to make sure that they lay out a roof that has decent south-facing solar orientation without a lot of penetrations, without a lot of things that are going to shade the system, because you only have one opportunity to orient that house. You also want to design your electric panels with some capacity so that you don't get yourself into a situation where you can't install the photovoltaic system because your electric panel would need to be upgraded in order to accommodate that. And then in some houses, depending upon how it's laid out, the conduits and the infrastructure to get wires from one place to another becomes important, but it's a little less so. I think the most important thing is the orientation and layout of the roof, followed by the capacity of the electric panel. Electricians are pretty slick and creative and capable of getting wires from one part of a house to another. So those things become less critical, but still useful. So you want to design the house up front with these things in mind.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Anthony, let's move to 8B. I think that will be a good next one.
All right. So for that question, we were going to ask, how do you think the cost of building green compared to standard building costs? Like, do you know where we can find kind of like more information on cost comparisons between standard building and like green building?
So it's all over the place. And the reason for that, and this was an example that came up quite a bit in my work as a private firm, was that we would occasionally have people who came into our office who had an out-of-town designer, somebody not familiar with what the requirements were locally, and say, hey, I got this house design, I brought it to the city, and they said, we have a lot of work to do. Can you green this home? Can you add on? And we would look at the plans and realize, they really needed to start over. Like they really hadn't accommodated any of the fundamental features involved with building an energy efficient home in the original design, and there was going to be all sorts of problems. And we've also had folks who come into our office from the start, and before we even started the napkin sketch, they say, I want a house that is energy efficient. I want a sustainable green building, and can you help us with that? And in those cases, the incremental additional costs are very, very small. So it depends a huge extent on when we designed it. When did we start thinking about the thickness of the walls properly? If you have just a simple thing where someone designs a house with a 2x4 wall, and then decides that they need to change that to a thicker wall assembly to accommodate greater insulation. Well, it moves everything around. Maybe now our bathrooms don't have the right clearance. Maybe we have things on the roof line that start to interfere with each other. So when you start to accommodate and plan for these things, determines to a very large extent how much it's going to cost. You can do some cost comparisons that the thicker insulation adds a little bit, and the better mechanical systems add a little bit, and you get to maybe a 5% price increase overall, and to some extent that would be unavoidable. But you can also have projects where adding it after the fact becomes prohibitively expensive. So the cost vary tremendously based upon when in that process you started trying to accommodate it. If you think about one of the ways that's really nice to reduce the energy loads on a building is to orient it so that it gets decent sun exposure. If you have a house where all of the windows are facing the western afternoon sun, you may have a building that has a huge cooling load to deal with that. But that same building, if it was rotated a little bit and you put it in the proper overhangs, that cooling load might have been very, very modest. And so the question is, are you putting in a giant air conditioner now and with huge ducts to accommodate this big load, or did you design it up front so that load wasn't even there? So it's really hard to get a simple comparison because the starting point is so complicated.
Now we're going to ask you about some of the impacts on the green building codes on housing costs, and what do you see as the social equity and economic impacts of these policies? Do you think it can affect some people greater, more negatively, or some groups more positively?
Yeah, I mean, as equity in housing is a huge problem, and it's one of the reasons why, as we've developed the codes in Boulder County, we have been far more aggressive with larger homes. And this is for a couple of reasons. One is that the larger homes simply use more energy and have a larger negative societal impact from their emissions. But it's also true that that some of especially when we're pushing the envelope, when we're trying to be pushed beyond whatever the builders are comfortable with, and push them to develop new techniques and use new materials. There's a bit of a learning curve associated with that, and so we've been trying to deliberately push that learning curve to be borne by the more affluent members of our society, and the smaller houses. We've been less aggressive, so that the people who are building the small homes today are actually benefiting from what the contractors and material suppliers and energy raters and designers and the whole industry learned on the real high-end custom homes that we were building 10 years ago. So there is a natural trickle-down effect. We've also been a little bit careful in terms of how we deal with, after we get to that Hearst 40 magic range where we have a really good envelope. We've also been careful in terms of how we push those smaller homes in terms of hitting these net zero targets that we have. Because if you're building a small house, you can only go so far in terms of the building envelope. That last bit, as I said before, that photovoltaic is a pretty straight up economic decision, and they may not have that upfront access to capital to get it all the way there. And so that's a place where we've tried to be much more gentle in terms of how we're in terms of the energy codes, so that we don't push those at the bottom end of the economic spectrum down further. Now, one of the things that's been really interesting is that at the national code hearings, the Home Builders Association gets up every year, time and time again, and talks about, we don't want this more efficient code because it reduces affordability. One of the things that has recently started to change is that groups that specialize and focus on affordability have now started to tune into this going on, and have gotten up to the mic and said, actually, affordability, we support these more aggressive green building codes for the reasons of affordability. Because what they are saying is that they have an easier time getting access for folks in that group to get into the houses, but they have a lot more difficulty helping them pay the high utility bills and stay in these houses. So what they're pushing for is very efficient homes that have low utility costs, because the utility bills are what ends up leading to people becoming foreclosed upon and losing housing, not these first costs. So there's some of the one of the first true net zero homes in the region was actually built by Habitat for Humanity in conjunction with the Department of Energy, because they were really pushing this idea of how do we reduce these operational costs so that when we do finally get people into homes, they can stay there. And low utility bills is a critical part of that.
That is a really good point. That makes sense. Do you think that with the new homes, people with lower incomes would have a hard time even getting into the home, or do you think they would still, have help getting in and then would have the lower utilities, which would help them stay long term?
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly an issue in this country with affordability. That first cost, getting into housing, it's a big deal. It's a big deal. Part of what drives this problem is this is the size of the house, right? We used to talk about this from the design perspective, but when projects were coming in over budget, the most reliable way to reduce the cost of the project was to make it a little bit smaller. That was the only thing that consistently and every time reduced costs was to make it a little bit smaller. And so, we have seen rising house sizes for a long, long time. They're much, much bigger than what housing used to be. If you look at the average housing that was being built in the 50s and the 60s, I think it's almost double what it is today in our region. Our houses are bigger, and it's even worse if you run the numbers on the housing size based upon the population of the house. So our family sizes have gone down, and our house sizes have gone up. So the number of square feet per person for a new home is way off compared to what it used to be. So when we're really trying to address affordability, part of what we need to be looking at is, how big are these houses? But yes, no, there's no question that there is a first cost problem that affects the baseline affordability, and especially in this region, it's expensive. If you look at what it takes for a new family, a homeowner to buy a property and build a house in any in Boulder County or any of the cities within Boulder County, it's clearly a problem.
You think we're good to move on to our last two questions, Stacey? So I guess kind of just two questions, just kind of to wrap this up, is we just wanted to ask if there's anything else important that you wanted to let us know that we haven't asked.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground, but I would say it's really important to understand the folks who might be objecting to a more progressive building code, to understand what their perspective is, and to help them help really address the issues. Right? Some people are maybe objecting to just not being able to build the way they used to build. And for those folks, I think there's a risk associated with that. People hear stories of problems. When higher levels of insulation were being pushed, people heard, and we had problems with moisture issues in wall assemblies, and contractors, rightly so, have been afraid of, look, I've been building a house this way since my grandfather showed me how to do it, and I'm afraid that if you tell me I got to build it differently, I'm going to be the one that they call with a warranty problem. I'm going to be the one who's taking that risk. And so you have to go above and beyond to help make sure that they understand how to build safely, how to build in a way that protects them from those risks. You have to make sure that the materials that they're being asked to use are readily available locally, and that the material suppliers understand how to use them, and they can offer the kinds of local support. So there's just a lot of moving parts to building, and you want to make sure that you are really hearing what the people who might be objecting to this are, and help really address those problems very directly.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. That was a lot of information, a lot of good stuff here. I'm glad we recorded it because there's so much there. And I think that's all we have. And we'll reach out to you if we have any further things. Or if you want to see our final presentation, we can definitely include you on that.
Yeah, I'd be really interested to see how this goes.
Excellent. Yeah, I'm hoping we're the kind of first stepping stone to helping them, get to those next steps in the green building codes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, I'm happy to help, and again, feel free to reach out if things come up, and good luck with the project.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, all
Great,
right, and I'll
thank you.
have to figure out how to record this, how to get the recording to you, and I'll see about trying to get that over to you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. Take care. Good luck.
Bye-bye.
Bye bye.